Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hope Steele from the TrackSAFE Foundation, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're each joining from today, their elders past and present, and I'm here in Canberra and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people. So welcome to our first webinar for 2023. Our session today is a really interesting one, and it's focusing on supporting colleagues through grief and loss. We plan to answer some questions towards the end of the session. So if you'd like to pop in a question, do so in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can, but perhaps there's also an opportunity for some follow-up after today. I'd also really encourage you to jump onto the Griefline website, which has an amazing range of resources, including podcasts, covering issues around grief and tools and how to help yourself and others in your life experiencing grief. So I'll get underway. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Amanda Trotter from Griefline. Amanda is a qualified counsellor with a very deep understanding of the grief experience. She's held roles at Griefline as an online community coordinator, seasonal counsellor, and also as Griefline's police line program, and 2 years volunteering on the helpline. So we're delighted to have you join us for today's session, and welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Hope, and thanks everybody at TrackSAFE for inviting Griefline along today. It's always commendable when organisations recognise that grief is so prevalent in our community, because it's often a topic that's very much misunderstood, and also there's a lot of stigma around it. So people just generally prefer not to talk about it. And I guess that's where Griefline, our mission is to support Australians to have more courageous conversations around grief. The fact is that we all experience it. It's a universal human experience. And in fact, it's the second most commonplace personal issue in the workplace now. And as we know, and that's in all workplaces, but I think we're all aware that in rail, in your industry, there is a propensity for more trauma and loss to be experienced. So that's what we wanted to address today is how to support your colleagues who've experienced grief and loss, and that might be in the workplace or it might be at home. So we'll get started. I guess the reason why I've chosen this little animation or movie for our first slide is that a lot of times when we're talking to people on our helpline, on the Griefline helpline, we use metaphors, and that can help people to, I guess, put into words what they're feeling. And a lot of the time we talk about grief as feeling like you're in an ocean with waves crashing over you. And at times you feel like, you can feel like you're being completely drowned by the waves, completely overwhelmed by grief. And then at times you'll come up for air, and you'll have moments where it's a bit easier. And that's very much akin to how grief can feel. Lots of ebbs and flows. And over time, hopefully those crashing waves will start to ease off a little bit, and we get our head above water again. So thank you, Hope, for telling us a little bit about Griefline. Yes, jump on our website. We have a lot of resources, online resources there for you to navigate if you're experiencing grief, or if you wanted to help somebody else experiencing grief. We also have a helpline that's available Monday to Friday, and we have a booked call service. You can jump online and book in a time to talk to one of our volunteers. And we have an online forum, which is a peer-to-peer space where people can share their grief experience. So lots of resources there for you. So grief, what is it? Well, most of us have experienced it, or unfortunately will experience it. I've got a little video here which I'll play, which gives a bit of I guess, how we perceive it at Griefline. Okay, and it appears that some people are not seeing audio or video, so not quite sure what's happening with that one. But let me know if you can't hear or see the next video. So I guess what we're in terms of a definition of grief, it is something that's very powerful. It is unpredictable, just like those crashing waves, and it can feel like it's uncontrollable. But something that's important to remember about grief is that it's actually an adaptive process. It exists so that we can survive through loss. And it's unique for every single individual. There's no set time frame. And we'll talk a little bit more about the different stages or the journey of grief a little bit later. So in terms of the prevalence of grief in Australia, there's approximately 160,000 deaths per year. And for every one of those deaths, around 9 people are impacted significantly. So that's a lot of people. That's about 1.5 million people walking around at any given time experiencing profound grief. And then that's caused by death, but then there are a lot of living losses that cause grief as well. So relationship breakdowns, and loss of job, chronic health conditions, diagnosis, those sorts of things. Here's a slide that breaks down a few more of those losses, the living losses. And it's really important to understand that the grief that we experience as a result of living losses can be equal to that of after we've lost someone that's very significant to us. So, sorry, I'm just getting a few notes popping up, so I'll just keep moving on. And in addition to those living losses that we've just had a look on the screen, another thing that can happen to us, and particularly when we experience traumatic events at work, in the workplace, is that we can get our assumptive world is what we call it. We basically, as we grow up, we create a world that we expect to be living in, and that's a world of safety. That's a world where we have some control over it, where we can feel that if we do the right thing, then the world's going to will respond in kind. And unfortunately, when things happen in the workplace, such as accidents and traumas and things like that, that we can lose that sense of predictability and safety, and we can feel like we've lost control over our destiny. So I guess it's a painful reminder that life's messy and unpredictable, uncontrollable, and really it's rarely what we expect it to be. And so really, if our experience in life matches our expectations for a good and happy life, we're fine. But if not, there's a gap, and that can be seen as a loss, and that can trigger the grief response as well. So I think that a lot of you are probably fairly familiar with trauma. I know that TrackSAFE does a lot of work in the trauma space in terms of educating and informing, and that's fantastic. But often people really don't understand the difference between trauma and grief. So I was really fortunate recently to have a conversation with Dr. Robert Gordon, who's a trauma and grief expert in Australia. And this was part of our podcast, the Life After Loss podcast. We were focusing on the Dandenong Ranges superstorms, but he gives a really good description of the difference between trauma and grief. So I wanted to play that for you. So I think it's important for us to have that differentiation between trauma and grief. And I think the important thing to remember is that we really can't start to grieve until we've processed the trauma. So you can have trauma without grief, but you can't have grief without trauma. So hopefully you'll be tapping into all the resources that are at hand that TrackSAFE have providing in terms of attending to trauma, and then then starting to step into your work around grief. So I wanted to just touch on some of the different types of grief. Anticipatory grief is something that comes along as a response to an impending loss. And so this is often something that you might be experiencing if you, for example, have someone in palliative care, a loved one in palliative care, or perhaps someone with an addiction, something along those lines, someone with dementia, etc. And so the grief that's experienced as a result of anticipatory grief can be exacerbated by feelings of dread and anxiety. So there's sort of another layer of stress on top of the usual grief response. Then there's ambiguous grief. So this is a type of grief that occurs when the person that we love, or the thing that we love. Generally, it is a person, but that they're physically present but psychologically or emotionally absent or changed. So often people who have a loved one that's struggling with addiction, perhaps who has had some kind of cognitive trauma. And so the person is there, but I guess that their personality is markedly changed. So often you'd be grieving the person that you once had, or the loved one that you once had. Disenfranchised grief is a response to a loss that's not acknowledged or validated by society. Often people will not actually disclose that they're grieving something for fear of judgment or criticism. Disenfranchised grief is probably the grief response that might be quite common in your workplace, because often when you're working in a workplace where there is a lot of loss, a lot of trauma, it becomes sort of an expectation that you deal with it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next slide. And then there's prolonged grief. And prolonged grief impacts around 10% of the population. This is when a person's grief, they're actively in grief for more than 12 months. And they're really finding that they're incapable of getting on with their normal day-to-day activity. And that's when grief becomes more pathological. So it's important to note that grief is, as I mentioned before, it's a natural adaptive response. It might feel, overwhelming, extremely painful, all of those things, but it is actually a natural thing. It's when we get into prolonged grief that we'd want to be seeking, perhaps some mental health therapy and that sort of thing. And so you'd want to go and seek medical advice on that. So back to disenfranchised grief, I wanted to just play you this quick audio grab. And this is from a paramedic. And I know sometimes, I believe that train drivers are sometimes, I guess, conceptualised as first responders, as a paramedic would be. And so they're the first on the scene when there is an accident. So I just wanted to play you this because often first responders are susceptible to disenfranchised grief. So I wonder if any of you if that's resonating with any of you, because it is common in the workplace, and certainly in workplaces such as yours, for people to put on a brave face in front of their colleagues and families. So at any given time, there may be, you know, a number of your colleagues, or indeed yourself, who are walking around experiencing grief. You know, we're basically prone to conditioning ourselves to suppress difficult emotions that arrive from distressing experiences at work. And I guess there are two things in common with disenfranchised grief, and that is shame and a lack of communal support. And that's something that we really want to try to address, and hopefully today will help in some way. So common experiences of grief, how does it impact us? Well, it impacts us across our psychological sphere, biological, social, and also spiritual. It's not just something that brings on, you know, I guess emotions of sadness and anger and shock, those sorts of things that we equate with grief. They are certainly a massive part of the experience. And it's a roller coaster of emotions. Basically, you know, there's the sadness, despair. People might experience avoidance. Some people even experience relief. You know, if, for example, the experience or the loved one had a tenuous relationship with them, so that can come about. But then there's the biological aspects as well. So we often on the helpline, we have a lot of people that will call up and talk about the fact that they're feeling nauseous. You know, they're having trouble sleeping. Some people talk about an actual heartache, and that's actually been proven to be an actual condition that can come with grief. You know, heart racing, shortness of breath, they're all things. And also lethargy is a very common experience. And I'm just seeing that there's a bit of trouble with hearing some of the content. So I'm hoping that we can fix that in the recording or later on. But social impact is another one. So people often become withdrawn and isolated. They start to avoid people and places. They might even change their faith. They might have a change in their belief system as a result of something traumatic happening to them and questioning their beliefs. And then there's also ruminating and obsessing over what's been lost. So all of these combined can, you know, will, I guess, show up in different ways for different people. So signs to look out for. So this will be what you might be looking out for in your workmates, and which might indicate that they are grieving, and just sort of being aware. So reduce concentration, forgetfulness, and motivation. And this can be really tough, obviously, in the workplace. You know, this is where we want to be. We want to be at our best, but our capacity is limited quite significantly by grief. So we often hear people talk about a grief fog, where they really can't it's very difficult to make decisions. So we've really got to give people a little bit of leeway in that regard when they are grieving. Often they'll be experiencing poor memory, a lot of memory loss, difficulty in recalling events or information. That could be potentially if it's related to a traumatic event, because often we are unable to put into words traumatic memories. They may be crying, distressed, experiencing frustration and emotional outbursts, feeling hopeless and helpless. Often there's changes in appetite and sleep patterns. And obviously when people are struggling with their sleep, that can also impact, you know, their abilities to function. There may be an increased use of drugs and or alcohol to cope. Obviously, it's a very common coping mechanism. And social withdrawal. So you might notice that they are actually withdrawing, you know, from, I guess, workplace social situations, or even just not their usual selves. And so that's something to look out for. So in terms of the grief journey, how long is it going to go? How long is it going to last? Well, there's no set there's no set time limit. The good news is that most people, the majority of people, will adapt and integrate their grief within 6 to 12 months, and bounce back. But if you have a look here, on the left, you'll see all of the stages of grief, and which is sort of a fairly linear line. And on the right is what the actual experience often is like. So it's definitely not 5 stages of grief. We've all heard about them: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They are all absolutely experiences that most people will contend with. Are you wanting to turn my camera on again? Is that me, Heather?
Yes, please. Yes, we've just lost you.
Oh, okay. Are you seeing
you're
me
there now? You're there now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, guys. The 5 stages of grief, they very rarely would occur in a linear fashion. Some people will experience all of those aspects. Some people may not. And then there are a whole lot of other stages that we would suggest are part of the grief experience. So really, it generally looks a lot more like the right-hand side of that diagram, where you're flitting from from shame to hope, back to fear, back to starting new relationships. It's a very, very messy experience, and there is no time frame, as I said. So in terms of getting over grief, well, we don't suggest that you generally will get over grief. Basically, the way we view it at Griefline is that we grow around our grief. So it will always be with us, but hopefully over time we can grow around it. So if you have a look at this diagram, we start off at the top left hand. People think that grief slowly gets smaller with time. In reality, grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it. So that's really a really hopeful way of looking at it, and of anticipating that we may be able to, find new purpose and meaning in our lives after grief. So in terms of supporting someone who's grieving, I love this quote from David Kessler, who's a renowned grief and loss author. Grief must be witnessed. We weren't meant to be an island of grief. And really, that's what we're offering each other when we reach out to each other in the workplace. We're offering to witness their grief, and that's really, really important because it's very validating. Active listening is a fantastic way for us to open up a conversation with somebody that's grieving. So I'm just going to play this video, and it's just got some really useful tips for how to actually listen and encourage someone to open up to you if they're grieving. Okay, I'll stop it there because that's obviously not an Australian-based video, but I think it's a really gives you some really simple tips on active listening, and that's really the most important thing. Certainly at Griefline on our helpline, we engage in active listening, and that's a really good way of developing a rapport with someone where they'll feel comfortable in opening up to you. So let's talk about some tips for supporting someone who's grieving. I guess the most important thing is starting the conversation, and this is really key. I know recently I lost my dad about 6 months ago now, and I did find that in the workplace, those people that didn't feel confident at coming up to me and expressing some kind of sympathy or whatever it might be, over time there was it was very uncomfortable, and it does drive a wedge between you. So I would always say start the conversation as soon as you can. To prevent that from happening. It's really important to validate their loss. So what that means is that you want to, I guess, listen to their story, listen to their version of the story. It's about not making any judgment around their experience. And like we saw in the active listening, it's about reflecting back what they're saying to you. And that just really makes them feel valued. It makes their experience feel valued. And really you're offering yourself as a safe and open support person that's willing to listen to their actual experience rather than making assumptions about how they should be experiencing it. Allowing difficult emotions. So it can be really tricky when people start crying, or perhaps they get angry, and that can be difficult for us to cope with. But we need to be strong, and we need to be tough, and allow that to happen. And if you feel emotional as well and start crying, that's not such a bad thing. Don't necessarily hold back on that, because when we mirror someone's emotions, that is also very validating for them, and people do want to see their emotions mirrored. That goes hand in hand with David Kessler's quote about witnessing their grief. Avoiding grief comparison. It's really easy for us to slip into comparing their grief with our grief. And like we talked about, we've all experienced grief of some sort. But we've got to remember that we can't ever truly understand what that person's feeling. One person's loss of a pet and their response to that might be equal, and often is equal, to a person's loss of, a loved one. And equally, so a person's loss of a home or the breakdown of their marriage might equally be, their grief response is of equal value to someone's loss of a person. So we've got to be really careful that we don't slip into that. Offer practical assistance. Just another example from my experience was one of my colleagues offered to put together the slideshow for my dad's memorial. Now that was just so helpful for a start, but it seemed to me to be very caring. The last thing you want to do is to go up to somebody and say, what can I do? Because what you're doing there is you're just basically transferring the burden of the decision making back onto them, and they've got enough to deal with. So really try to think about what you can offer in terms of practical assistance. And stick with them. We've talked about grief is a roller coaster ride. They may appear like they're coming to terms with their grief, and then they might fall into a hole again. So we really need to be aware that that grief is ongoing, and we want to stick by them. So in the workplace, there are some particular things that you can tap into to show your support. So I guess obviously if the person is grieving and they're at home, just letting them know that that you're supporting them, that you're thinking of them, whether that's in person, in writing, sending them an email. Anything is worthwhile. And don't diminish a text, for example. It just those words of encouragement and support can be very, very meaningful. Like I've said, offering them with concrete tasks and commitments, then this might be work-based. So understanding that their capacity may be reduced. If there's something that you might be able to assist them with, or if as a team you can work out some ways that you can support them in their tasks, that's a great thing to do. And then also, obviously, if you have an EAP available or qualified counselling, suggesting that they tap into that, because a lot of people are reticent to tap into counselling, but it's just such a lovely way to be able to kind of express feelings. So it shouldn't be something that people shy away from. Another thing is continue to invite them to social gatherings. So whether they choose to or not, it's important that they be included. It just creates some sort of sense of normalcy for them, and just shows them that you haven't given up on them. And be mindful of events such as anniversaries of the traumatic event or the death or whatever it might be, and then around holiday times and special occasions. Such as Christmas and Easters and that sort of thing. That's when people really, really can be triggered. So just being mindful that you might just want to check in on them at those times. And then, being aware of the grief and loss resources that are available, and just letting them know if you feel like that they might be that might help them. So obviously, Grief Line, once you've had a chance to have a look at our resources, please feel free to refer them on. It's important to show cultural competency. So in any workplace, obviously, most workplaces now are very culturally diverse. So when we're dealing with grief, it can often be quite advantageous just to kind of educate yourself a little bit about what their appropriate tributes are and that sort of thing. You can always check in with the person, ask them, how do you mourn in your culture? Don't be afraid to ask those questions so that you can respond appropriately. Obviously, where appropriate, you might want to attend the funeral or service. As a workplace, creating a joint tribute or a gift is really nice. And then checking in. Back, as I said before, just keep on checking in. So there can be some barriers to providing support that it's important that you're aware of, because I guess the first thing is don't feel bad if you're offering support and they don't necessarily seem to want to accept that. And that happens a lot. It's probably nothing to do with you. It's probably more likely that they're just not in a position as yet to take on support. So don't feel bad, but at least you've offered the support. But just check in on yourself whether they can rely on you to be trustworthy and respectful of their privacy. Can you assure yourself that you're not necessarily going to feel like you need to break their trust in any way? Make sure they feel accepted and respected and not judged by you. This can be very, in particular, if there's some sort of power imbalance between the two of you, just be aware of that. Often people are highly sensitive that are grieving. So if, for example, you're a team leader, giving them advice, that can I guess, not always be taken in the best possible light. So just make sure that they feel like they're on equal terms with you when you're talking about their grief experience. Make sure that you can offer emotional support that's gentle, considerate, and understanding. And then, of course, we want to talk about coping with your own loss, because we all experience loss, and often we can. If one person in your workplace has experienced a trauma, that may mean that you also have. So I wanted to also talk about coping with your own loss. I think the number one thing is, is self-reflection, noticing how you're feeling, being able to name perhaps the emotions that you're experiencing, and being curious around your own grief. And that can be really helpful to be curious, because remember that grief is an active process. It's not just something that's happening to you. It's something that you're engaging with. So adopting an approach of curiosity. So this is an emotions wheel, and you can find these easily. And you can see all of these descriptors for our emotions. And that can be really helpful because often we find it difficult to articulate how we're feeling. So those sorts of resources and tools can be really helpful. And like we've talked about before, talk with your colleagues, reach out to them, connect with them. In your workplace, it's likely that you're working and socialising with people that have a shared lived experience. And this is one of the most therapeutic coping strategies, is talking to someone that's gone through the same thing that you have. Seek comfort from others, like we've talked about. Reach out to others. Connect with people who have had a shared experience. Express your emotions using something like that, like the emotions wheel. Share your story of loss. So don't be afraid to, I guess, really break it down and really go deep into how you're feeling. Something that's really helpful is giving and receiving random acts of kindness. So when we're, I guess, when we've been through something so difficult, so challenging, it can be helpful to reach out to others and to help them. I guess it restores, it empowers us. It restores some sort of purpose and meaning in our lives. And yeah, it's a really helpful activity to do when you're grieving. Like I said, engage in your faith if that's something that's important to you. Seek help and educate yourself. Well, you're doing that right now, so you're on the path. Self-compassion is really important when you're grieving. Remember that our minds need time to heal as well. So you might want to look at pursuing positive emotions. So often when we're grieving, we sometimes feel like we need to dwell in these negative emotions. And yes, that's a really important part of processing grief. But it's also important to know that to be open to happiness and laughter and gratitude and hope as well. For some people, we suggest compartmentalizing their grief. So they might want to actually schedule in a couple of hours to grieve, and then allow themselves for the rest of the time to go on with their life and to open themselves up to sort of peace and some light. So naming your feelings, like we've talked about before, give yourself permission to cry, and forgive yourself, because often there's a lot of shame and guilt around grief. But forgive yourself for this, because it is a very human emotion. Now, I'm noticing that we're really running short on time. So I just wanted to point out a couple of the resources that we have on the website. If you look here, there's a whole bunch of resources. There's a worksheet there, Recognise Your Inner Strength, Circle of Support, and there's accompanying articles that tell you all about how to tap into those resources. So I encourage you to have a look at those. And I think I can finish off now. There's a little bit more about resources, but I can finish off now, Hope, and open it up to questions quickly.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Some amazing content there. And just to reiterate, Griefline's website is just full of some really fantastic resources, including some podcasts. So encourage you to jump on there. One of the questions we had, Amanda, was around sort of how what's your advice on sort of referencing or talking about someone who might have passed to someone who's grieving, and using their name, or talking about sort of experiences or things that that might have happened, because sometimes it just feels like a really sensitive space. Yeah.
Great question, and I'm really glad you brought it up. We absolutely 100% encourage you to say their name. Say the name of the person that's passed. When you're doing that, it works on a couple of levels. It honours the person that has died. And that's really important. It allows the person that is grieving to continue the bond. And that's a very therapeutic way of a coping strategy. It means that they can continue to talk about them, have them in their life. They don't have to cut ties with that person forever. Just by sort of talking about them, they still remain part of their life. So absolutely say their name.
Thank you. That's good advice. Any questions that anyone wants to sort of throw towards Amanda before we wrap up? You've covered so much great content there, Amanda, and this is our first webinar which we'll be hosting with GriefLine this year. We've got another 2 coming up later in the year, so I'll keep everyone updated and covering different sort of parts of grief, but I think they're things that you'll be really interested in. Apologies for some of the sound issues that some of you were experiencing on those recorded snippets. We'll make sure we share the slides, and also we might be able to perhaps grab some of those audios separately as well. I'll talk to Amanda about that when we also put up our recording, just to make sure you can all hear that. Some lovely comments coming through from people. So thank you again, Amanda, and to GriefLine and everyone for joining us today, and enjoy your afternoon, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.